Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin daf samcha. We're going to get started with the braita reference to the two braitot that we saw in yesterday's daf. So let's just review the two braitot. One they're going to call the Tana de Rav, which is really from the Sifra, which is a Midrash Halacham Sefer Vayikra, also known as Torah Kohanim, and it was attributed to the school of Rav. So that was the first braita, well, not the first braita, but the first braita we saw at the bottom of Samachay that was identifying what are the different locusts mentioned in the verse. Et Elamehem tuchlu et arbe ze govai, salam ze vashon, chagol ze nipul, chagav ze gidyan, right? We had what each of these types are. And then we had lemineu, 4 times appears to bring 4 more types. Okay, without getting into the details of what makes each of these types unique. Then we had the braita of Rabbi Yishmael, which did something very, very similar, but it did it in a bit of a different manner. So the braita of Rabbi Yishmael at the very bottom of Samachem Aleph said these are the klalim and these are the prate, right? The klalei klalot and the prate pratot, right? The very general and then the very specific. And then it said arbez govai and then limino. Instead of saying limino 4 times, and that just adds on 4 extra grasshoppers, what they do here is they say arbez govai, and lemino is something that's like the govai. And then we had all the similarities and the differences. This one has a bald spot, no bald spot, with a tail, not with a tail. And then we went through all the different details of what each one comes to include, and then each one comes to include another case. Now, in the end, it sounded quite similar to what the first braita was getting at. So if you remember, also, I'll just remind you of one other thing without going through all of yesterday's bet. But we had there that in the end, it was a little confusing. You didn't really need all the words. So they said really from number 1 and number 3, arben chargol, you really already get yesh gabachad ein gabacha, right? With the bald spot, without the bald spot, with a tail, without a tail. And you really didn't need salam because salam already has one way it's similar to number 1 and one way it's similar to number 3. And you could have gotten everything from 1 and 2. And then they said that with 1 and 3, number 2, salam must be coming to teach you. It can't be teaching you about itself because that's already obvious from 1 and 3. So therefore, it must be teaching you if the head is long, which none of these grasshoppers had the long head. If the head is long, it's also included. And that is going to be the point of contention that was also after Rav Achai's whole interpretation of it. That is, and I mean, the truth is it appeared there in the braita also, but Rav Achai explained it in that way, 1 and 3, and then from 2 we get to Rosh HaMaroch, because according to the first way of reading it, it didn't really explain how they got to Rosh HaMaroch. Because remember, all these grasshoppers don't have long heads, okay? And then that's where we're starting today, which is B'mai kamiflagei Tana de Rav v'Tana de Rabbi Yishmael. What really is the machloket between the two of them? B'rosho aroch kamiflagei. They're arguing about a locust with a long head. Tana de Rav, the first braita holds asher lo kra'ayim klal. This is the way to read it. Now we're going to describe what hermeneutic principles were implemented here in each one. So Tana de Rav holds like this. We're going to use a klal uprat. How does a klal uprat work? You remember? Ein beklal ela masha beprat. When you have a general term and then you have a specific one, that means that it's only going to be like the specific ones. And these specific ones have no long head, right? None of them have a long head, and therefore we're not going to include the long head. That's how it's going to go. So what do they say? Asher lo kra'ayim. Okay, this is the pasuk. This is what you can eat from the sheretz of ha'olech al arba. Asher lo kra'ayim yimayel raglav l'neterben al haaretz. And then it starts going through which ones you can eat. Asher lo kra'ayim, it has these jumping legs. That's a klal. It's a pretty general principle. A lot of them have that. But then arbez, salam, chargov, chagav, lemineu, prat. But then it has all the different types, and those are all specific. And even the word lemineu, what is lemineu? Lemineu is a bit of a general term, right? Because it's saying, and anything like this. But this is going to be the point of contention between them. Rav used lemineu as, well, what's lemineu? Like these. So, arbe and lemino, and like a salam and lemineu. It's just things that are similar to those. That's all part of a prat. That's not a general term. So, if you have a klal and then a prat, and you have no klal at the end, then the rule is ein bechlal amasha beprat. Demine in, delav demine lo. It's only things that are just like the prat. So the arbe, the salam, the chargol, the chagav, all of them have the very specifics that none of them have a long head, and therefore long head is not included in kosher grasshoppers. And they say one more thing, which is umurabe dedamele mishnei tzadim. And then they include things that are like it in two ways. Okay, why two ways? It's actually in four ways, right? We had all the four things that it has to have, the kartzulayim and this and that. But what they mean here, likely, I mean, there's different interpretations. Some try to get it into two categories and say, oh, well, it's asher lo kra'ayim and some other siman or something like that. But what they really seem to mean here is it's in many ways, meaning in most of the ways, okay, or in all the ways. As opposed to, we're going to see in a minute, which is going to be the klal u'prat klal, where it's just going to have to be similar in one way, okay? But they're basically saying whether it's one or two or just a little and a lot. So Tanid be Rabbi Yishmael savar, asher lo kra'ayim klal, arbe salam chargol chagav prat, leminehu chazar v'kalal. Here's the big machloket. Is leminehu a word that's all of a sudden a general word, or is it not a general word? So Rabbi Yishmael views it as a general word because it's not so specific like arbeh and salam and chargol and all the different types. So he views it as a klal u'pratu klal. And the rule, when you have a klal u'pratu klal, when you start general, you go specific, but then you go general again, that's including more things, right? So klal u'pratu klal iyatadan ela ke'ena prat. So when you have a klal u'pratu klal, it's like the prat, but mirabe kol dedamele b'chad sab, but it includes anything like it in even just one way. So as long as you have this grasshopper that has other similarities to the ones listed in the pasuk, even though its head is long, it's still going to be included. Okay, and that's the difference between them. So now, before we move on, we have a question on this. But this klal u'pratu klal is a very strange one, and that was why there was a machloket about it. But they're going to ask on Rabbi Yishmael and say, "V'halo dami klala kama leklala bratra." They're really not the same. They're very different, right? Because klala kama is asher lo kra'ayim, which is this general, and klala batra is lemineu of the arbeh and its type, and the salam and its type, and it's very specific. So klala kama asher lo kra'ayim amar rachmana di'i le'echol deleit le'lo techol. In other words, the klal kama is you just need the kra'ayim. As long as you have those jumping legs, you're fine. You can eat them. And if you don't have it, you can't eat them. And klal batra is ad shavu barabas simanim. But the klal batra, the second one, is it has to have all those four things. That's much more specific. That's not a general term. To which they say, Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael b'klali uprate ki agavna dayin. The Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael has no problem doing klal u'prat like this. He thinks this is a klal u'prat. And then they go farther to say, Udamrina nami ba'alma dedayin tana debei Rabbi Yishmael b'klali u'prat ki agavna. And where they say that in general, if you ever remember in Chas, we actually have this in the beginning of Zvachim, you can look back at Zvachim Daf Dalet, where basically it says there that Rabbi Yishmael does call klal u'prat in this way. Well, guess what? Mehacha. This is the source for it, okay? This is the source for the fact this klal u'prat is the famous klal u'prat. That from there they took the general rule that Rabbi Yishmael has no problem doing a klal u'prat, even if the klal and it's the klal prat u'klal, even when the first klal and the last klal are quite different from each other, okay? He doesn't mind that. Usually you need like in Aveda, for example, it's et kol Aveda, like every Aveda, and then, that you're going to find, and you find anything. And then it's general at the beginning, general at the end, completely general, not with any specific, limitations really. So, or that both general terms are basically including the same items. But here it's a little bit different, but Rabbi Yishmael, his approach is, and obviously Rav's is not, because that's why Rav disagrees, and doesn't think that it's a klal u'prat. So what we learned in this first section is, the reason why, number one, what's the difference between them? Well, Rav doesn't include the ones with the long head, and Rabbi Yishmael does. And the reason is because Rav thinks this is a klal u'prat, and Rabbi Yishmael thinks it's a klal u'prat u'klal. Klal u'prat u'klal is always going to include more items, even if they're not completely similar to the ones discussed. Now we have two more questions on these braitot. So the first is just on Rabbi Yishmael, and the second is, you kind of say it's on Rabbi Yishmael, but it's really on both. There seems to be a contradiction between the two, which we kind of glossed over and didn't pay attention to. So if you want to look back and try to figure it out right now, you can, or you can wait till we get there in a minute. So the first is, Amar Mar, Ish mochagav, yachol af ein bo kol hasimanim halalu. If you remember, they said in the braita of Rabbi Yishmael, it said, what about the tzirtzur, the cricket? maybe we should include that. That has arba raglayim, arba knafayim, kartzulayim, knafayim, chofim, rubo. Have those 4 signs. Maybe it should be permitted. So they say, well, you need something additional. Besides everything we mentioned, has to be called a chagav. So then the braita said, well, if you're going to say it has to be called a chagav, then, right, a cricket's not a grasshopper, it's a cricket, right, not included. Well, ishmo chagav yachol ein bo kol hasimanim alalu. Maybe anything called a chagav that doesn't have the simanim, if the name is so important, then maybe any grasshopper will be permitted if it's called grasshopper. Talmud lomar lemineu ad sheyeh bo kol hasimanim alalu. But the braita said, no, it says lemineu, it has to be like the types we mentioned. But the Gemara wants to understand what we call the havamina. What was it thinking in the first place? What was it thinking that you could just include everything? What do you mean? We saw arbeh, chargol, salam, right? All those seem to be very specific. So why would you have thought to say chagav could maybe include any chagav? To which they say, right? So ein bo kol hasimanim alalu mehechitite. So then where would you get it from, this concept that you don't need all the simanim? We just had all those 4, or particularly the 3. Arbeh, Hargol, and Salam. And wouldn't that teach you that you need to be specific and not just any chagav? Well, they say like this, right? And they say Arbeh v'Hargol ktiv, right? We already said Arbeh and Hargol, with gabacha, without gabacha, with a tail, without a tail, and they have, but what's unique about them, right? They have all those 4 simanim we talked about. So they say like this. Remember, now, I specifically started class with this. There's Arbeh, Salam, Hargol. So from 1 and 3 in the end, right, arbeh and chargol, we learn the yesh lo zanav, ein lo zanav, yesh lo gabachat, ein lo gabachat. And then we said, well, what happened to number 2? Why do you need salam then? And then we said, well, I guess you don't really need salam because the gabachat's like that one and the zanav's like that one, and okay, we're good. So why is the salam there? It's extra to say it's an imeno inyan. If we can't learn from it to our case, like what's unique about this, what its characteristics are, then we must be teaching something else, and we jumped from there to say, even if it has a long head. Right? That was Rabbi Yishmael. So now they say, well, ilo ktiv salam kidikamarta. If it hadn't said salam, and it just said arbeh and chargol, then you're right. Each one is there to tell you specific characteristics, and from there I would assume it needs to be very similar to the arbeh and the chargol. But hashde diktiv salam lirabuye rosho aroch. But now that we added this extra word, which is this extra type, which is completely unnecessary, and we said it's to teach you even rosham aroch, ema lirabi nami kolduhu. Maybe that word could be taught to say not even rosham aroch. Maybe it's coming to include every type of grasshopper. Again, presume as long as it's called a chagav, which was the 4th word in that, right? We had arbeh, salam, chargol, chagav. So maybe with chagav and salam together, you could say, oh, anything called chagav, because look, the word salam is including even other things. Kamash malan, that's why the braita need to tell you, no, don't take salam that far. It's not to teach you every type of grasshopper. It's only ones that are similar in these ways, and it just added this extra one of Rosho Aroch. Okay, now we have one last question, and here's the contradiction that you probably didn't notice. Okay, Maishna, and maybe it's my fault you didn't notice it, because I went over this part pretty quickly because it didn't seem so significant. Well, not significant for us because we didn't understand these words. So what am I talking about? Well, if you remember, in the beginning it said, okay, I'm going to go back to the first braita of Rav. Arbeh ze govai, salam ze rashon, chargol ze nipul, chagav ze gadyan. Okay, this didn't really help us because just defining them by grasshoppers that they knew in their day, which doesn't really mean very much to us. Now, if you look in the braita of Rabbi Yishmael, he says, arbeh ze govai, that's the same. Then he says, salam ze nipul. And then it says, chargol ze rashon. Now, you might notice that you might not notice, but chargol is nipul, and salam ze rashon, right? Here it says the opposite. It says chargol is rashon. Okay, so the way chargol and salam are flipped between the braita of Rav and the braita of Rabbi Yishmael. So now we're going to read it inside. Ma'ishna hatam ta'amart salam ze rashon chargol ze nipul, u'ma'ishna hachad amart salam ze nipul v'chargol ze rashon. Okay, they each define each grasshopper there as a different type. And remember, we built this whole theory on this has this characteristic, that has that characteristic, to which they answer, don't worry about this, marki atre or marki atre. In other words, salam is still the way we describe the salam, and chargol is still the way we describe the chargol. Remember, the chargol didn't have a tail, right? Had a tail. The others didn't have a tail. Okay? Now, they're still that way. But in one town, they called it Rashon, and in a different town, they called it Nipul. Okay? So the Nipul and Rashon meant different things in different places. Okay? But salam and chargol is still the same. It's just that the one that they called Rashon was the same as the other one called Nipul. And in different places, right, where Rav was and where Rabbi Yishmael was, or the school where the braita was written, each one meant something else in their time. Okay. Moving on. Now we're finished with grasshoppers, and we're moving on to fish. Okay, we're going to get to the real stuff in a minute. This is just a side point, which is the same side point we had when we got to the grasshopper stuff. Tanu Rabbanan, ein lo achshav atid legadel la'achar zman. What if they don't have, now it's not fins, you're not going to grow fins later, but scales. It doesn't have scales now, but later it will have scales. Kigon, hasultanit va'afyan, 2 types of fish that grow scales later. Harez and mutar. Okay, this is permitted. As long as it will ultimately have scales when it gets older. When it's young, you can still eat it even though it doesn't have scales right now. Yesh lo achshav, now the reverse case, yesh lo achshav atid lashiram b'sha'ah she'oleh min hamayim, if it has scales, but it's going to shed them as it comes out of the water, kigon, like for example, turning out Amud Bet, akunas va'akfunas, kaspatias, va'akspastias, va'atunas, okay, Rashi points out this is all in the Persian language, okay, in case you didn't realize. And, okay, what's the identity of these? Most of them we don't really know. The atunas is tuna, that we know. And the akspastias is a big subject of debate because people say it's a swordfish. And a swordfish was a big subject of debate for many years. They didn't used to eat it. Now some people think you can eat it because they think that that's the identity of this fish. Okay? So, anyway, harez mutar, we have, if it, again, it didn't have scales, but it's going to grow them as it matures, or it sheds them as it comes out of the water, then it's permitted. Okay, Tnanatam. Now we're quoting a Mishnah in Nida. Now, why this Mishnah is in Nida? Excellent question. Very simply, it's there because there's a list of, okay, we're going to see, kosher yesh lo this, yesh lo that, kosher ein lo this, if you have this, you have that, okay? It's a whole slew of Mishnayot that are repeated, that are there because of the mnemonics, okay? It has nothing to do with Nida. So there's a Mishnah there. You would think this really belongs here. I don't know why it's not here. Kosher yesh lo kaskeset, yesh lo snapir. Any fish that has scales definitely has fins, okay? So if you see a fish with scales, you know, you don't even have to check for fins, it definitely has fins. Now there's some with fins that don't have scales. So you might have fins and not scales, but you'll never have scales without fins. Yesh lo kaskeset v'yesh lo snapir dag tahor. So obviously, I mean, this doesn't need to be said, but if it has, this is just the Mishnah. If it has kaskeset and snapir, it has scales and it has fins, dag tahor. It's kosher fish. Yesh lo snapir v'ein lo kaskeset, but if you're in that category of fish that has fins but no scales, dag tameh. That's not a kosher fish. Okay, so now the obvious question. Michteh kaskeset kasamchinan, since we rely on kaskeset alone, because if you have scales, you know it has fins. So lichtav rachmana kaskesef, lo lichtav snapir. Why didn't the Torah just write? All you need to look for is a fish with scales. You don't need a fish with fins because if the fish has scales, that's all you need a fish with fins, but it doesn't make a difference because as long as you check the scales, you'll know it has fins. So why did it bother writing fins at all? Ikat rachmana velo kaskeset. Here they're going to try to answer. If they wrote kaskeset scales, velo katav snapir, and they didn't write fins, Hava Amina, I might have thought, my kaskeset snapir. Now what they're saying is, who knows what these words kaskeset and snapir are? Maybe you would think that it needs fins and not scales. And then you'd be wrong, because if it has fins with no scales, it's a dag, right? It's not a kosher fish, right? Vafilu dag tameh, then you would include even non-kosher fish. Therefore, katav rachmana snapir v'kaskeset. That's why it wrote snapir and kaskeset, so that you would know there's two things, and then you would know that definitely you wouldn't think, oh, maybe one of them is, maybe it's, if it's only one, maybe that one is fins. So this way you get covered your fins and your scales. Okay, this is a bit of a strange answer, because how do you know it didn't mean something else, right? So the Gemara is going to ask a question, which is like a question within a question, okay? So it's going to take a little while to get to the full question, they're going to say like this. You're assuming, okay, here, they're going to add 2 words. You're assuming from what we just said that Hasha de Kata Brahmanis Napir v'Kaskeset, right? Now, Mimai de Kaskeset Levushahu. Now, the fact that they wrote Napir and Kaskeset, how do we know the Kaskeset is scales? Okay? How do we know that? We know that because we know that, but how? Okay, where do we get it from? Well, in fact, we're going to learn that you get it from a different pasuk. Okay? How do we know that now it says Napir and Kaskeset, that Napir is fins and Kaskeset is scales? Dichtiv Bishiryon Kaskasim Hu Lavush. This is about Goliath. When Goliath meets David in Sefer Shmuel, it says he was wearing an armor of scales. Okay? You can look at the Quran. They have pictures of an armor of scales. It was a type of armor they used to use. Okay? Now, so that's how you know the kaskeset. They call it levush. How do you know it's levush? It's clothing, meaning it's what the fish wears on its body, as opposed to fins, which are just coming out of the sides. But how do you know they're scales, meaning what we call scales? That's the one that's on the body. You actually know it from this pasuk in Goliath. Okay. So therefore, this goes back to our original question. Lichtav Rachmana Kaskeset v'lo lichtav Snapir. Well, if you know from the pasuk in Shmuel what a kaskeset is, then if our whole theory was they had to write Snapir and kaskeset, because otherwise you might have thought kaskeset was fins, but you definitely wouldn't say that because he doesn't have an armor with fins on it. Okay? So, now you might say, wait a minute, the Torah was written before Goliath, right, and before Sefer Shmuel was written, okay? But the assumption here is that if they wrote about it in Goliath and in the Navi there, they obviously knew what a kaskeset was, okay? They knew what kaskesim were. It was obvious. No one was going to get confused. So, why is it here? So, why do we have to add snapir then? And the whole theory was you have to add snapir, otherwise you won't know what kaskesim are. Rabbi Yishmael, v'chein tana de Rabbi Yishmael, yagdil Torah v'yadil. This is an interesting answer. We want to enlarge the Torah and glorify it, and that's why we wrote snapir also. Okay, this could mean a few different things. This could mean we want to make sure everyone understands the Torah by glorifying it, and therefore, even though we just proved that everyone's going to know what kaskesim are, just in case someone doesn't, make it clear, you need a snapir and a kaskeset, because otherwise people might just search for fins, and then you're going to be in trouble because if it doesn't have scales, it's not kosher. So it could be that that's what it means, like dil Torah v'ladio. Some people say that it really just means that, and actually some people say that that there's something else going on here. The snapir. Now this goes to a theory that what are these simanim? Are the simanim of snapir v'kaskeset just happen to be that there's X amount of kosher fish and X amount of non-kosher fish, and every kosher fish happens to have fins and scales. Okay, but it's not that that's a reason why it's kosher. It's just a sign of a kosher fish. Okay, or is it inherently, right, this is why they're kosher, because they have fins and because they have scales, and the Ritva tries to explain the theory about the fins and scales are inherently kosher. There's something about them that make the fish kosher, and that's why they're telling you about fins. So while it's true that if it has scales, it definitely has fins. But they wanted you to know what the reason is for these being the kosher fish, and that's why they said the fact that it has scales and the fact that it has fins is all connected to why they're kosher. Okay, so you can read up about it. I didn't research enough to understand what the real reason is and how these connect, but that's an interesting thing. I'll give you another example where this comes up. Okay, very relevant for women. So mitzvot asish hazman grama, right? Women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot, positive commandments. Now, why are they exempt from time-bound commandments? So often people will say, well, their time is not their own, and they come up with all these explanations about why women's time is not their own. And the fact, right, this is a siman, this is like saying the snapir and kaskeset are the reasons why the fish are not kosher, right? The time-bound is the issue, and that's why women are exempt from them. But there's another school of thought that says that there was a list of mitzvot that women were exempt from, and when the rabbis looked at the mitzvot, each one for for whatever reason, and when the rabbis looked at the mitzvot, they said, what's the common denominator between all these mitzvot? If we had to come up with a category, they're all time-bound. And that's why, by the way, there happen to be all sorts of exceptions to the rule. Because, right, that it begs the question, if it's really, that's the reason, then why are there time-bound mitzvot the women are commanded in? So, in the Gemara there in Kiddushin, where it comes up, asks, well, why about this one? What about that one? And they come up with explanations. But it could be very simply because they just said this is the common thread that goes through all the commandments that they're exempt from, but not that it's because they're time-bound and that's why women are exempt. Does So it's the same kind of idea there. And so anyway, that is a possible explanation of Yagil to Rabbi Yadir. To understand it properly, they want to tell us Snapir, even though you don't really need it for practical purposes. But to understand it, as to what the reason is because they have fins. That's part of the reason why they're kosher. Okay, moving on. Tanu Rabbanan. We have two braitot to deal with today for the rest of today. One is a little simpler, one is quite complicated, and we're not going to even fully understand it till tomorrow. We're going to continue this braita. So they're both dealing with the psukim about the fish. So the first thing, I'm going to read you the psukim right now, so you read them and understand them, and then we'll see where we get off from on these braitot. In chapter 11 of Vayikra, in verse 9, Et zeh tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. Now, I want you to pay attention to a lot of these words. First drasha, we don't need them all, but for the second, we're going to need a lot of them. This is what you should eat from everything in the water. Kol asher lo snapir v'kaskeset b'mayim b'yamim u'b'nechalim otam tochelu. Everything that has fins and scales in the water. What water? Well, in the seas and in the streams. Those you should eat. There's a lot of strange things about this pasuk. First of all, it says b'mayim in the beginning of the pasuk, in water. Then it says in water again, and then it tells you what types of water, which are seas and streams. Also, it says at the beginning, et zeh tochlu, this is what you should eat. And then it says at the end of the pasuk, otam tochelu, those you should eat. A lot of weird things. That's all going to be the subject of the second drasha. The next pasuk is, v'chol asher ein lo snapir v'kaskeset, if it doesn't have fins and scales, bayamim u'b'nechalim, again, in the seas and in the streams, mikol sheretz hamayim, from all the water creatures, u'mikol nefesh chaya asher b'mayim, and anything else that grows in the water, sheketz hem lachem, v'sheketz yu lachem, and in the next pasuk already, mibsaram lo tochelu, don't eat from their flesh. So now we have a strange pasuk. If it tells you you can only eat the ones with fins and scales, why does it have to tell you you can't eat the ones that don't have fins and scales? Wouldn't that be obvious? So that's what the first braita talks about. Tanu Rabbanan. Mimash mashenemar echolet mashe yeshlo. Since it tells you eat what has fins and scales, shomeani al tochalet mashe einlo. I would already infer don't eat what doesn't have fins and scales. Umimash mashenemar al tochalet she'einlo. And let's say it just had the second pasuk. Don't eat what doesn't have fins and scales. Shomeani echolet mashe yeshlo. I would have assumed I could then eat fish that have fins and scales. So lama shna'an. So why did they repeat it? Lavor alav ba'aseh v'lo taseh. They wanted you to know that if you eat fish without fins and scales, you're going to transgress, not keeping a positive commandment, and also going against a negative prohibition. So you'll get lashes for the negative prohibition, and in addition, you'll have not done a positive commandment. Okay, why is this positive, not done a positive commandment? What it means is not like you have a mitzvah to eat fish that are kosher, but they say that a mitzvah aseh, that implies a mitzvah lo taseh, right? A michlal, a lava ba michlal aseh. If you say you have to eat fish that have fins and scales, you can understand I can't eat fish that don't have fins and scales. And a negative prohibition that is derived from a positive one actually has the status of an aseh, of a positive commandment, because it never says don't. Okay, so if you eat non-kosher fish, you've not fulfilled the negative prohibition that comes out of the positive commandment. And you've also transgressed the negative commandment that's in the second and third verse. Okay, so that's why it says both. So meaning this is more severe because you've done two things wrong. The Rambam actually says that there's a mitzvah aseh that you've transgressed, which is you're supposed to check the simanim. He claims that that's the mitzvah aseh here. So that's a little bit of a different interpretation. Okay, now we're getting to the second drasha, which is a little more complicated. Tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. So now they want to understand, what are we darshaning from those first words? Et zeh tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. This is what you should eat from all that's in the water, because the end of the pasuk says, whatever has fins and scales, that's in the water, that's in the streams and the seas, that's what you should eat. So why does it say that's what you should eat in the water in the beginning of the verse? It's a complete repetition. Matamud lama. So what's it doing here? She'achol ho'il v'hitir b'mfoash v'hitir b'stam. Okay, they're going to refer to something that we have no idea what it is. I'm going to explain it to you. Okay, the first thing you have to understand is that they believed in those days that there was, I'm not sure if it's called spontaneous reproduction, spontaneous something, I forget if it's called reproduction, but or spontaneous creation, that creatures were created, there were creatures that were created from the ground, okay, or even what we're going to talk about, spontaneous regeneration, thank you, that was the word, spontaneous regeneration. They believed in spontaneous regeneration, that not all creatures were That's why reproduction, I knew was the wrong word, right? Are created by reproduction. But they were spontaneously generated from the ground. Okay? Spontaneous generation, okay? However we want to call it, I think you understand the concept. Or whether you understand the concept, that's a better question. Okay? But they thought that that's how creatures were created. That some creatures were created in that way. So what they're going to be talking about right now is, can you drink water that's in a vessel, that maybe in that vessel there were creatures that were created in it that are like fish because they're living in water. Okay, they're not exactly fish, but they're living in the water, and they might be microscopic. You might not even be able to see them. Okay, and they might, right? Now, what the theory here is going to be that if they're created in the vessel, okay, with, let's say there was, soil in, I don't know, but they thought they were created in this vessel, then they don't need fins and scales. Okay? Meaning you don't have to check if you see a creature in there to check, does this have fins and scales? No, you're allowed to eat it. Meaning you can drink water and not, what they're really saying is you drink water and not worry that maybe you're drinking something with it. Because if it was generated in there, it's not a problem. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about right here. So let me just read it inside and then you'll see. So they're going to say like this. Okay, we don't yet know. This is a classic Midrash Halakha. It starts at the pasuk that we're going to darshan, but we're not darshaning it yet. The pasuk we're going to darshan is "Etzet tochlu mikol asher b'mayim." This is what you can eat that's in the water. Matzah mulomar. So what's that doing there? So yachol ho'il v'hitir b'mforash v'hitir b'stam. Okay, they're making reference to something without explaining what it is. We're going to get to it later. But hitir explicitly, they permitted this explicitly, and they permitted it in a way that wasn't explicit in the pasuk. But they permitted in two ways. Tomorrow the Gemara is going to say where was the miforash, where was the stam. But they permitted, what we're going to learn is water in vessels. Okay, so one place it was explicit in the pasuk, one place it wasn't explicit in the pasuk. They permitted in from two places, water in vessels. Okay, meaning creatures in vessels without having to check for fins and scales. Okay, they don't tell you this, but this is what they mean. So, af mashi tir b'mforash lo hitir ela b'kelim. Okay, now we get it. Now, when they permitted it from the explicit pasuk, they only permitted it in the vessels. So, af kashitir. Now, you might have thought this is the yachol. You might have thought af kashitir b'stam from the place where we learned it. It was not explicit. Lo hitir ela b'kelim. You might have thought that also from the second verse it only permits it from vessels. Minayin lerabot. Now here comes the halacha that we're going to derive from our pasuk. Minayin lerabot borot shichinu ma'arot sheshochev v'shoteh mehem ve'eno nimna. How do you know that if this water in a pit, in a ditch, okay, the difference between a pit and a ditch is a pit is rounded, a ditch is rectangular, or a ma'ara, which is a cave, like a cistern in a cave, which is covered but open on the side, that you can bow down v'shoteh mehem and drink from them, and you don't have to worry about it. So now we're going to see not only, right, are we not worried about creatures that were generated in a vessel, but even ones generated in a pit, a cistern, any of those are fine as well. How do we know that? Talmud lomar, tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. So now we get to the drasha from our verse. Tochlu kol asher b'mayim comes to include even things that were generated, even creatures that were generated in these pits, cisterns, ditches are fine. You can drink the water there and you don't have to worry that they have fins and scales. That's what they derive from the beginning of this verse. The vessels know. In the vessels, it comes from something else. But, which we're going to see that. But et zet tochlu mikol asher b'mayim, that's coming to include even pits and cisterns and ditches. Okay, so now they want to know, Hechani tir b'kelim, where do you see the heter by vessels? Dichtiv, because now we're going backwards. Okay, let's try to understand this. Et zet tochlu mikol asher b'mayim v'chulei, that's the beginning. Bayamim u'benechalim. Now later in the pasuk it says, right, in the water, and then it says in the seas and in the streams. So when the pasuk says, this is what you can eat in the water, anything that has fins and scales, which is in the water, in the seas and the streams, The seas and the streams means only in the seas and the streams do you have to go check for snapir and kaskeset. Ha b'kelim, from the fact that it says water and seas and streams, we know for sure it's excluding vessels. Okay, water and vessels. Ha b'kelim af agav deleit le'echol. So in a vessel, even if you don't check fins and scales, you can eat them. Ema, they say, what do you mean? Ema, why don't you say, we're going to now have two suggestions to knock out this drasha. Ema b'kelim af agav de'it le lo techol. Maybe it's excluding kelim because it wants to say, what is this pasuk telling you? If it has fins and scales, you can eat it in the sea and in the stream. Maybe it means if it has fins and scales, but it's in a vessel, you can't eat it. Meaning you can't even eat it even if it has fins and scales. You can't eat any creature in the water, in a vessel. If the water's in a vessel, you can't. So now we're going to say, lo sal kadatach. No, you can't infer that because look at the next pasuk. Dichtiv. What's forbidden to eat? Anything that doesn't have fins and scales that's in the seas and in the streams. So you see, that means in the seas and streams you can't eat it, but in other places you can eat it. So that's why, right, biyamim u'b'nechalim hu deleit le lo techol, ha b'kelim af agav deleit le echol. So from the second verse it's very clear. Since you can't eat fish without fins and scales in the seas, but you can eat them if they're in a vessel. Okay, so now we've established the vessel part. And again, right, and we tried to say maybe it's the opposite. Maybe a vessel is even worse. No. Okay, from there we get the vessel. And then again, what's the drasha? Edzeh tochlu, right, is edzeh tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. That addition, because from the end of the pasuk you can already get water and vessels, because it said seas and streams to exclude water and vessels. Well, then the first line of that pasuk must be referring to something additional. We're going to go one step farther. Okay? So we now have things like ditches and caves, okay, things like that. Now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. Ema b'mayim klal, b'yamim u'nechalim prat, klal u'prat, ein b'prat b'klal u'masher b'prat. We're going to go back to what we started from today. Is it a klal u'prat or is it klal u'prat u'klal? Okay? So if it's a klal and prat, remember we're going to be very specific. So why don't we say, it starts off, right, that, or really the end of the pasuk, it says b'mayim. I want you to notice, there's b'mayim in the beginning of the pasuk, which is very general, any water it sounds like. Then there's mayim later, right? The kol asher lo snapir v'kaskesed b'mayim, b'yamim u'b'nechalim. Yamim and nechalim are obviously the prats. So right now, they're saying, look, now really it's a klal u'prat. It's not a klal u'prat u'klal, because mayim, right? So the first answer is say, okay, this isn't the klal u'prat, because it says mayim. It's not a klal prat and then klal, because the klal doesn't come at the end. So we view this as mayim as a klal, yamim u'nechalim as a prat, klal u'prat, ein b'klal u'masher b'prat. Yamim u'nechalim in, ne'itzim v'charitzim lo. So maybe you say, now we didn't talk about this. What if there's streaming water, but it's not a sea, it's more like a small pool that there's flowing water? Or a charitz, which is a channel, where there's flowing water through the channel. That's much smaller than a stream. So, right, it would be reasonable that you would say, yamim u'nechalim, only when they're like yamim u'nechalim, because it's a klal and then a prat, mayim, and then it says specifically yamim u'nechalim, only big bodies of water. B'mayim chazar, so now they say, you wouldn't say that, because it's really forbidden in streaming water. Any streaming water is forbidden. Okay, to eat any creatures there without checking for fins and scales. Why is that? Because b'mayim chazar v'kalal. Because it's a klal u'prat u'klal. To which the Gemara is going to ask, how could you call it a klal u'prat u'klal? It's a klal u'prat. Hane tre klale d'smicha l'adadin. The two klals are next to each other. It's mayim, yamim, and nechalim. So, Amar Ravina, ked Amre b'marava, kol makom she'ata motzei shnei klalot asmuchin ze lezeh, hatel prat b'nehem, v'dunam b'prat u'klal. Okay, so he's going to say no. It really is a klal u'prat, because in Israel they say another thing, right? We started with Rabbi Yishmael, who has this unique kind of klal u'prat, where he thinks it's anyway a klal u'prat u'klal, even if the second klal isn't like the first klal. This is another unique exception. Even if the second klal doesn't come after the prat, you view it as if we kind of do a cut and paste. We move the klal to the end, and we view it still as a klal u'prat, and klal, and tomorrow we'll go through in more detail what this klal pratu klal is, what includes, what doesn't include, and we're going to read it all tomorrow. So we kind of leave mid-sugya without fully understanding this whole section, but we're going to end here as the daf ends here, and we'll pick this up tomorrow. So we started with the machloket between the Tanuz Bei Rav and the Tanuz Bei Rabbi Yishmael about the grasshoppers, and why one is including the Rosh HaMaroch and the other one's not. Then we had some two side questions about the Ishmo Chagav, and then they're saying, why would you think that, why would they even have this suggestion that maybe it includes anything called a Chagav? And then they said it's all because of that word salam, which includes more things. And then maybe it includes even more. And then we ended with the contradiction of salam is Rashon, and the other one says salam is Nipul, and Chargol, and they have it all flipped, and we said that's because they call these things different things in different places. Okay. Then we moved to the fish, and we had number one. If it's going to grow scales later, or if it sheds its scales as it comes out, those are all kosher. Then we said scales is the main thing you need to look for, because once it has scales, it obviously has fins. Fins is not enough to look for on its own, because you could have fins and no scales. And then we said, well, then why does it say fins? And then we said it's like dil Torah ladira, which we had some different interpretations what that means. Then we got to these two drashot. One is, why does it repeat? Why are there two psukim? One saying, this is what you should eat, and this is what you can't eat, when you could infer one from the other. And we said that's because we want you to know that this is more severe. You're going to transgress also a positive and also a negative prohibition if you eat fish without fins and scales. And then we got to this other drasha, which was, well, we know already that fish, that creatures or fish in bowls that generated in the bowl are completely permitted. You don't have to check for fins and scales. How do we know that it's the same? What's the halacha for cisterns, pits, and ditches? Water, are we allowed to drink water from there and not worry about these microscopic creatures that might be there? Or if we see something, do we have to worry about it? That maybe, that only have fish, fins, and scales? And the answer is no. And that we learn from those extra words in the beginning of the pasuk, et zeh tochlu mikol hamayim, mikol asher b'mayim. And then we're in the middle of trying to understand this, how we darshan this pasuk, because now we're going to learn that there's in bowls, right? They're in a vessel. There's in the ditches. Then we go one step farther, which is flowing water that's in a channel or a pool, as opposed to what it says in the pasuk of the big sea and the big streams. So what we see is that numbers 3 and 4, right, the last two are definitely a problem. You have to check for fins and scales, and that we just darshan right now from a klal pratin klal. Okay, and then we're going to continue on this tomorrow, and we'll figure everything else out that we haven't yet figured out. With that, wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.